Sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one everyone mistakes for invisible. The security guard barely glanced up as Ethan Walker stepped through the revolving doors of Bennett Dynamics, carrying a neatly folded resume in one hand and a worn lunchbox in the other. At 41 years old, he looked like the kind of man people forgot 5 seconds after passing him in a hallway. His navy work jacket had been carefully pressed despite years of use. His boots were polished until they reflected the marble floor, and the silver strand beginning to appear around his temples only made the quiet kindness in his blue eyes seem older than his age. Outside, a cold October wind swept through downtown Chicago, rattling the bright banners hanging from the glass towers. But inside the lobby, everything shimmered with polished stone, soft piano music, and the scent of fresh coffee drifting from the executive cafe. Ethan paused for only a heartbeat before walking toward the reception desk. "Good morning," he said politely. "I'm here about the janitor position." The receptionist looked up from her computer, forced a professional smile, and reached for the clipboard without recognizing that the man standing in front of her had once been introduced on stages far grander than this building. "Name?" she asked. "Ethan Walker." She wrote it down without hesitation, handed him a visitor badge, and pointed toward the waiting area. Ethan thanked her with the same gentle tone he used when speaking to everyone, whether they were executives or strangers. He sat quietly beside a large window overlooking the city skyline, while other applicants whispered among themselves. Some wore expensive suits, hoping for management positions. Others rehearsed confident speeches beneath their breath. Ethan simply folded his hands together and waited. His thoughts drifted toward home, where his 10-year-old daughter, Grace, was probably finishing her spelling test at Lincoln Elementary. Before leaving that morning, she had slipped a tiny folded note into his lunchbox. He already knew what it said because she wrote nearly the same words every interview. "You always come home, my hero." A faint smile crossed his face. He did not need a prestigious title anymore. He only needed honest work, steady health insurance, and enough income to keep his promise that Grace would never feel alone after losing her mother 4 years earlier. Across the lobby, 2 human resources coordinators quietly reviewed resumes. One frowned as she reached Ethan's application. "This has to be a mistake," she whispered. "A bachelor's degree in engineering applying to clean floors?" Her coworker shrugged. "People make strange choices when life falls apart." They exchanged amused smiles before placing his folder near the bottom of the stack. High above them on the 32nd floor, Olivia Bennett, founder and billionaire chief executive officer of Bennett Dynamics, concluded a board meeting with her usual calm authority. Every executive in the room rose as she gathered her tablet and prepared to leave. She rarely involved herself in hiring anyone below senior leadership, but as she stepped into the private elevator, her assistant hurried beside her holding a digital hiring report. "There is one unusual applicant today," the assistant said casually. "Probably nothing important." Olivia accepted the tablet without much interest, scrolling through names while the elevator descended. Her expression remained composed until one file filled the screen. The moment her eyes landed on 2 simple words, the color slowly drained from her face. "Ethan Walker." Her breathing stopped for a single heartbeat. The elevator continued downward in perfect silence, but for Olivia Bennett, time itself seemed to stand completely still. Olivia Bennett remained perfectly still as the private elevator descended floor by floor. Yet the simple name glowing on the tablet seemed louder than the quiet mechanical hum surrounding her. Her assistant noticed the unusual silence and tilted her head with concern. "Is everything all right, Miss Bennett?" Olivia did not answer immediately. Her fingers tightened ever so slightly around the tablet, while memories she had carefully locked away for nearly 15 years quietly resurfaced. The polished stainless steel walls reflected her composed expression, but behind her, calm eyes, an entirely different world had begun unfolding. She remembered another autumn morning long before Bennett Dynamics occupied glass towers across the country. Back then, she had been nothing more than an exhausted engineering student working 2 jobs, surviving on scholarship money and determination. She had spent countless nights alone inside the university laboratory, convinced she was one failed project away from losing everything she had fought so hard to build. Then one evening, after every other student had gone home, someone quietly placed a notebook beside her workstation. There was no speech, no expectation of gratitude, only several pages filled with elegant calculations correcting an impossible design problem that had kept her awake for weeks. At the bottom of the final page was a single handwritten sentence. Great ideas deserve another chance. Beneath those words appeared one signature. Ethan Walker. She never forgot that name. While professors praised her breakthrough weeks later, she searched everywhere for the quiet graduate student who had helped her without asking for recognition. But he had already accepted another opportunity and disappeared before graduation. Years passed. Companies were built. Fortunes were earned. Awards filled shelves. Yet whenever reporters asked who had inspired her philosophy of leadership, Olivia always smiled politely and answered that true success belonged to those who quietly lifted others without expecting applause. She had never revealed where she first learned that lesson. The elevator doors opened softly onto the executive lobby. Her assistant stepped aside, expecting her to continue toward another meeting, but Olivia remained standing for another moment. "Cancel my lunch appointment," she said calmly. "Also postpone the investor conference by 30 minutes. The assistant blinked in surprise. "Is there an emergency?" Olivia looked once more at the digital application. "Perhaps," she answered softly. "I need to verify something myself." Downstairs, Ethan sat exactly where the receptionist had directed him. A maintenance employee pushing a supply cart accidentally dropped several folders across the marble floor. Before anyone else reacted, Ethan quietly stood, knelt beside the scattered papers, and helped organize every page into neat stacks. "Thank you," the older employee said with an embarrassed smile. "These hands are not as steady as they used to be." Ethan handed back the folders with genuine warmth. "That just means they have worked hard for a long time." The older man smiled wider than he had all morning. Nearby, two applicants watched the exchange with amused expressions. One whispered, "He is already acting like the janitor." Ethan either did not hear them or chose not to respond. He simply returned to his chair, opened his lunchbox, and noticed Grace's folded note resting beside a simple turkey sandwich and a bright red apple. He read the familiar words once more before carefully placing the note back inside. His shoulders relaxed as though his daughter's handwriting alone carried enough strength to quiet every fear inside him. High above the lobby, Olivia stepped onto the observation balcony overlooking the vast entrance hall below. Hundreds of employees moved through the building like clockwork, but her eyes found him almost immediately. He looked older than the young man she remembered, his posture touched by years of responsibility. Yet there was something unmistakably familiar in the way he thanked a stranger, the way he waited without impatience, and the quiet dignity that no hardship had managed to erase. Olivia whispered to herself so softly that even the wind against the glass could barely hear the words. "It really is you, Ethan." The human resources manager finally stepped into the waiting area with a polite but practiced smile that revealed nothing about the decision ahead. "Mr. Walker," she called. Ethan rose immediately, buttoned his jacket, and followed her down a quiet hallway lined with framed photographs celebrating decades of innovation. Every picture displayed confident executives shaking hands, launching products, and receiving awards. Ethan glanced at them only briefly before returning his attention to the path ahead. He had learned years ago that success looked different depending on who was telling the story. Inside, a modest interview room, a small table held 2 chairs, a glass pitcher of water, and a notebook waiting to be filled. The manager invited him to sit. "Your resume is unusual," she admitted with a courteous smile. "You have qualifications that seem far beyond this position." Ethan folded his hands comfortably. Qualifications do not always pay this month's rent. She hesitated before asking the question that had puzzled everyone reviewing his application. "May I ask why someone with your background is applying for custodial work?" Ethan looked through the window overlooking the city, where the afternoon sunlight reflected across hundreds of windows like scattered pieces of gold. Because honest work has never embarrassed me, he answered quietly. Every job that helps provide for my daughter deserves respect. His calm response lingered in the room longer than either of them expected. At that very moment, Olivia watched the interview through a discreet live security feed available only to executive leadership. She had originally intended to observe for only a minute, but she remained standing without speaking. There was no trace of bitterness in Ethan's voice, no complaint about life, no attempt to impress anyone with stories of the past. The man she remembered had always believed character spoke loudest when no one was listening. It appeared that time had not changed him. Across town, the final school bell rang at Lincoln Elementary. 10-year-old Grace Walker carefully zipped her backpack before joining the stream of children heading toward the front entrance. While many students hurried into waiting sport utility vehicles or climbed aboard buses, Grace walked 2 blocks to the neighborhood library exactly as she did every Tuesday. Mrs. Evelyn Carter, the elderly librarian, greeted her with a warm smile. "Your father has another interview today." Grace nodded hopefully. "I think this one feels different." Mrs. Carter handed her a hot cup of apple cider. "Your father has a remarkable way of making difficult days look gentle." Grace smiled with quiet pride. "He says that people remember how you treat them much longer than they remember what job you have." Back at Bennett Dynamics, the interview continued. The manager asked about scheduling, physical work, and building maintenance. Ethan answered every question honestly without trying to exaggerate his experience. Then she reached the final page of his application. "There is a 6-year gap here," she said carefully. "Would you like to explain it?" Ethan lowered his eyes for only a moment before looking back with the same peaceful expression. "My wife became seriously ill. Taking care of her became my full-time job until she passed away. After that, my daughter needed her father more than any career needed an engineer." The room fell silent. There was no dramatic pause, no attempt to earn sympathy. Only the simple truth spoken with quiet dignity. Even through the monitor, Olivia felt an unexpected heaviness settle over her heart. She remembered reading articles years ago about a brilliant engineer who had suddenly disappeared from the technology industry without explanation. Analysts speculated about business failures, secret investments, or private scandals. None of them had known the real reason. None of them had known that while the world measured success through promotions and headlines, Ethan Walker had quietly chosen love over recognition. Olivia slowly closed the tablet in her hands and whispered almost to herself, "You did not disappear because you failed. You disappeared because you kept your promise to your family." The interview ended with a warm handshake and a promise that someone from the hiring department would contact him within a few days. Ethan thanked the manager sincerely before collecting his lunchbox and visitor badge. There was no disappointment on his face, no anxious glance back toward the conference room door. Only the quiet acceptance of a man who had learned that patience often carried more strength than certainty. As he stepped into the lobby, he noticed the elderly maintenance employee struggling to push an overloaded cleaning cart across the polished floor. One of the wheels had locked sideways, causing the cart to veer awkwardly toward a decorative planter. Without hesitation, Ethan walked over. "May I give you a hand?" he asked with an easy smile. The older man chuckled softly. "I've been wrestling with this thing all morning." Ethan knelt beside the cart, examined the wheel for only a few seconds, then reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small folding screwdriver that looked as though it had been with him for years. He adjusted one loose bracket, tightened a worn bolt, and gently spun the wheel with his hand. It rolled smoothly again. "There you go," he said, standing up and brushing the dust from his hands. It only needed a little attention. The maintenance employee tested the cart with visible relief. "You just saved me another maintenance request." Ethan smiled. Sometimes people only need someone willing to look a little closer. Unknown to both men, Olivia had quietly stepped onto the executive balcony overlooking the lobby instead of returning to her office. She watched every movement without announcing her presence. She noticed that Ethan never looked around to see who might be watching. He did not wait for thanks, nor did he mention that repairing equipment had once been second nature to him. He simply helped because someone needed help. The simplicity of the moment stirred something inside her that quarterly reports and shareholder meetings never could. Nearby, a young intern carrying a stack of presentation binders accidentally stumbled as several folders slipped across the marble floor. Color rushed into the young woman's face as papers scattered in every direction. Before security or reception could react, Ethan was already gathering the pages one by one. "Do not worry," he said gently. "Everyone has days when gravity seems unusually determined." The intern laughed through her embarrassment. "Thank you. I thought I had ruined everything." Ethan carefully organized the documents according to their numbered tabs before handing them back. Nothing important was lost. "Take a slow breath. You still have plenty of time." She thanked him twice before hurrying toward the elevators with renewed confidence. Olivia noticed something remarkable. Every person Ethan helped left the conversation standing a little taller than before. He never solved only the practical problem. Somehow he quietly restored dignity at the same time. She turned toward her executive assistant, who had remained respectfully several steps behind. "Tell Human Resources to delay their hiring decision until tomorrow morning," Olivia instructed calmly. The assistant looked surprised. "Do you want additional background checks?" Olivia nodded thoughtfully. "I want his entire professional history. Every patent, every employer, every recommendation, every public record. And do not tell anyone I requested it." "Yes, Miss Bennett." As the assistant walked away, Olivia rested one hand against the cool glass overlooking the bustling lobby. 15 years earlier, she had admired Ethan Walker because he believed brilliant minds should serve people before profits. Now, watching him quietly encourage strangers while applying for one of the most overlooked jobs in the building, she realized that belief had never changed. The titles were gone. The recognition had faded. The wealth had disappeared. Yet the man remained exactly the same. And for the first time in many years, Olivia wondered whether the company she had spent her entire life building was finally about to receive the leader it had needed all along. Even if he had arrived carrying nothing more than a worn lunchbox, a humble resume, and a heart that success had never managed to change. The following morning arrived wrapped in a pale gray sky as Ethan walked Grace to Lincoln Elementary before catching the city bus toward Bennett Dynamics. The little girl adjusted the straps of her backpack and looked up at him with a quiet confidence that always seemed far older than her 10 years. "Do you think they will call today?" she asked. Ethan smiled as he tucked a loose strand of blonde hair behind her ear. "If they do, we will be grateful. If they do not, we will keep moving forward." Grace reached into her pocket and placed a small silver coin into his hand. "Mom said this was your lucky coin." Ethan looked at it for a moment before closing his fingers around it. "Your mother also believed that kindness made better luck than any coin ever could." Grace nodded proudly before disappearing through the school doors with a cheerful wave. An hour later, Ethan received a phone call inviting him back to Bennett Dynamics for a final employment discussion. He arrived wearing the same carefully pressed jacket and carrying the same worn lunchbox. As he entered the lobby, several employees hurried past preparing for an important executive presentation scheduled later that afternoon. The atmosphere buzzed with urgency, keyboards clicking, phones ringing, and polished shoes echoing across the marble floor. Nobody paid much attention to the quiet applicant sitting patiently near the reception desk. While waiting, Ethan noticed a young facilities technician kneeling beside a decorative indoor fountain. The water pump had stopped circulating, causing the water to become unusually cloudy. The technician sighed with frustration while scrolling through a maintenance manual on his tablet. "This thing picked the worst possible day to fail," he muttered. Ethan approached slowly. "Would you mind if I took a quick look?" The technician hesitated before stepping aside. "Be my guest, although maintenance has already ordered replacement parts." Ethan removed the fountain's lower access panel and quietly studied the mechanism for less than a minute. He noticed a small intake valve clogged by mineral deposits and a slightly twisted rubber seal preventing proper water flow. Without asking for additional tools, he carefully cleaned the valve using a soft cloth from his lunchbox and gently repositioned the seal. Moments later, the pump hummed back to life. Crystal clear water rose smoothly through the stone centerpiece, filling the lobby once again with its calming sound. The technician blinked in disbelief. "How did you know that?" Ethan smiled modestly. "Machines usually tell you what is wrong if you listen long enough." Before the technician could ask another question, Ethan quietly replaced the access panel and returned to his chair as though nothing unusual had happened. Several nearby employees applauded lightly, assuming he had simply been lucky. One manager chuckled. "Maybe we should hire him for maintenance instead of janitorial work." Ethan simply smiled without responding. High above the lobby, Olivia had witnessed the entire exchange through the floor-to-ceiling windows outside her executive office. She recognized something nobody else seemed to notice. Ethan never rushed. He never showed off. Every movement reflected years of disciplined observation rather than coincidence. Her assistant entered carrying a thick, confidential folder. "The background report you requested has arrived." Olivia opened it carefully. The first page listed engineering awards, published research, and patents that had quietly transformed entire manufacturing systems years earlier. Additional pages revealed letters from respected professors, executives, and community organizations describing Ethan with remarkably similar words. Brilliant, humble, trustworthy, selfless. The final recommendation stopped Olivia completely. It had been written by one of the nation's most respected engineering pioneers shortly before his retirement. The final sentence read, "If character could be measured with the same precision as mathematics, Ethan Walker will be the standard against which every leader should be judged." Olivia slowly closed the folder and looked down toward the lobby where Ethan sat reading Grace's folded note while eating a simple homemade sandwich. Surrounded by polished glass, billion-dollar decisions, and extraordinary ambition, the most remarkable person inside Bennett Dynamics remained the only one who seemed completely unaware of his own greatness. Ivy Reynolds, the director of human resources, entered the executive office carrying a second folder that had been retrieved from the company's archive partnership records. "There is something else you should see," she said quietly as she placed it beside Olivia. "This file was never digitized because it predates Bennett Dynamics." Olivia opened the aging folder carefully. Inside rested copies of engineering journals, handwritten design sketches, and a faded photograph from a national innovation conference nearly 16 years earlier. There, standing in the back row with a modest smile and his conference badge hanging slightly crooked, was Ethan Walker. Around him stood inventors who had since become industry legends. Olivia remembered that day vividly. Everyone had gathered around famous keynote speakers while Ethan quietly answered questions from struggling students in the hallway instead of promoting his own work. She had been one of those students. As she turned another page, a newspaper clipping caught her attention. The headline celebrated a revolutionary energy optimization system that eventually became the foundation for dozens of modern manufacturing facilities across the country. Ethan's name appeared among the lead designers. Yet the accompanying article mentioned that he had donated his entire performance bonus to establish scholarships for children whose parents worked hourly factory jobs. Olivia slowly lowered the paper. "He never told anyone," she whispered. Ivy shook her head. "Every recommendation says the same thing. He avoided publicity whenever possible." Another document revealed that Ethan had declined several executive positions because accepting them would have required relocating his family while his wife underwent long-term medical treatment. Instead, he accepted consulting work from home until the contracts gradually disappeared. There were no lawsuits, no scandals, no reckless investments. His career had simply become smaller as his responsibilities at home became greater. Olivia closed her eyes for a brief moment. The business world had interpreted his silence as failure because it could not imagine someone willingly placing family before ambition. Downstairs, Ethan waited in a quiet conference room while the hiring committee completed its final discussions. Through the large window, he watched autumn leaves drift across the company courtyard where employees enjoyed their lunch break. A young custodian entered carrying a mop bucket and accidentally bumped into the doorframe, spilling water across the polished floor. "I am so sorry," the embarrassed young man said, immediately reaching for paper towels. Ethan stood without hesitation. "Let me help." Together, they cleaned the floor in less than a minute. "First week?" Ethan asked with an encouraging smile. The young custodian nodded nervously. "It shows that much." Ethan chuckled softly. "Only because you care about doing a good job. That is usually how I can tell." The young man smiled with visible relief. "Most people only notice mistakes." Ethan handed him the last dry towel. "The best supervisors notice effort first." Their conversation ended as naturally as it had begun, leaving the young employee standing a little straighter than before. From the mezzanine balcony above, Olivia had quietly arrived once again without announcing herself. She watched Ethan encourage another stranger with the same gentle respect he offered everyone else. It suddenly became clear that his greatest gift had never been engineering alone. It was the rare ability to make ordinary people believe they mattered. Her phone vibrated softly. The chairman of the board was calling to remind her about the afternoon executive strategy meeting attended by senior investors and department heads. Olivia answered calmly. "I will be there in a few minutes." She ended the call, but did not move. Instead, she looked once more toward the quiet man sitting beside the conference room window, unaware that the truth about his forgotten past was no longer buried inside old files. It was about to walk into the brightest room in the building, where people who measured success by titles and fortunes would soon discover that the greatest legacy any person could leave behind was neither wealth nor recognition, but the lives quietly changed along the way. The executive strategy meeting began precisely at 2 o'clock as department leaders, investors, and senior engineers filled the glass-walled conference hall overlooking downtown Chicago. Digital screens displayed charts, financial projections, and a blueprint for Bennett Dynamics' most ambitious manufacturing expansion in company history. Olivia Bennett stood at the head of the long walnut table, calm as always, listening while her chief technology officer presented the final simulation before construction approval. Halfway through the presentation, the largest screen suddenly froze. The animated production model began producing conflicting data, causing error messages to spread across every connected display. Confused voices quietly filled the room. "That cannot be right. Run the simulation again. The numbers are drifting." Several engineers opened laptops, comparing calculations while technicians attempted to restart the system. The room grew increasingly tense. Every minute of delay threatened a presentation scheduled with international investors later that afternoon. Downstairs, Ethan had just completed the final paperwork confirming that his application remained under review. As he prepared to leave, the young facilities technician he had helped earlier hurried toward him. "Mr. Walker, would you mind taking one quick look? The executive conference floor is having another technical issue. I know it is probably beyond building maintenance, but I figured it could not hurt to ask." Ethan hesitated politely. "I am only an applicant." "I know," the technician replied with an embarrassed smile. "But sometimes fresh eyes notice what everyone else misses." Ethan agreed only because he believed helping someone never required a job title. Moments later, he quietly entered the conference floor through a side service corridor. No one inside the meeting paid attention to the man wearing a visitor badge. They remained focused on complicated graphs flashing across the giant display. Ethan stopped several feet behind the technicians, watching silently for less than a minute. Then he spoke in the same calm voice he always used. "May I ask one question?" The room briefly turned toward him with puzzled expressions. One senior engineer frowned. "This meeting is restricted." Before security could respond, Olivia gently raised one hand. "Let him speak." Ethan stepped closer to the display without touching anything. "When did the synchronization errors begin?" The chief technology officer answered almost automatically. "After this morning's software optimization update." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "Did anyone verify whether the older calibration tables remained active after the update?" The engineers exchanged uncertain glances before one rapidly searched through the system settings. His eyes widened. The legacy calibration protocol is still overriding the new model. Another engineer quickly disabled the outdated file, and restarted the simulation. Within seconds, the error messages disappeared. Clean projections filled every screen. Production estimates stabilized perfectly. The room became completely silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Nobody applauded. Nobody spoke. They simply stared first at the restored data, then at the quiet visitor standing beside the wall with his hands folded behind his back. Ethan offered a modest smile. Sometimes two good systems simply need permission to stop arguing with each other. He turned as though preparing to leave, believing his small contribution had ended. Olivia slowly stood from her chair. Every executive instinct told her to continue the meeting, but something far more important had just happened. She looked around the conference room filled with brilliant professionals, many of whom had spent the last hour searching for an answer that one humble applicant had found in less than 60 seconds. Then her eyes returned to Ethan. The same quiet graduate student who had once changed her future without asking for recognition had just done it again. This time, however, Olivia made a decision she had waited 15 years to make. "Mr. Walker," she said gently, her voice carrying through the silent room, "before you leave, there is something everyone here deserves to know about you." The conference room remained so quiet that the gentle hum of the ceiling lights seemed louder than anyone's breathing. Ethan stopped beside the doorway and turned back with a puzzled expression. Olivia walked slowly toward him, not as the billionaire who owned the company, but as a woman finally standing before someone she had searched for far longer than anyone knew. She held the worn conference photograph in one hand, its edges softened by time. "Most of you know me as the founder of Bennett Dynamics," she began calmly, looking around the room. "Very few know that 15 years ago, I almost abandoned engineering altogether." Curious glances spread around the table. The board members had heard countless stories about Olivia's determination, but never this one. She looked at Ethan with quiet gratitude. "I was overwhelmed, exhausted, and convinced that I did not belong in this profession. Then one evening, someone I barely knew stayed behind after everyone else had gone home. He solved the problem that none of my professors could explain, left his notes on my desk, signed his name, and walked away without waiting for a thank you." Ethan lowered his eyes, searching his memory. Olivia smiled gently. "You probably do not even remember doing it." Ethan thought for several silent seconds before a faint look of recognition crossed his face. "The turbine efficiency equations," he said softly. "You were the student working alone in laboratory 4. Olivia nodded, her eyes shining with emotion she rarely allowed anyone to see. "Yes, that single act changed my life." The executives listened without moving. "I graduated because of your encouragement," Olivia continued. "I founded this company because you taught me that knowledge should lift people instead of impressing them. Every leadership principle displayed on the walls of this building began with one sentence you wrote on a notebook that you probably forgot years ago. Great ideas deserve another chance." Several people instinctively turned toward the company values engraved in brushed steel along the conference room wall. Respect, integrity, service, quiet excellence. Olivia smiled softly. "Those words were inspired by you." Ethan looked genuinely surprised. "I never expected anyone to remember something so small." Olivia shook her head. "That is exactly why I never forgot." She handed him the old photograph. Ethan studied the younger version of himself, standing among engineers whose names had become famous over the years. He smiled quietly. "Life feels very different now, does it?" Olivia asked kindly. "Everything I've seen today tells me you are still exactly the same man." She gestured toward the executives surrounding them. "You repaired equipment without being asked. You encouraged employees who believed nobody noticed them. You solved the technical crisis without seeking credit. 15 years have passed, but your character has not changed." A thoughtful silence settled across the room. Even the senior investors who normally measured conversations in dollars seemed to understand that they were witnessing something far more valuable than a business discussion. Ethan looked around the conference table before speaking with the same gentle honesty that had guided him throughout the day. "The truth is that after my wife became ill, awards stopped matching. Every day, she smiled, was a greater success than any promotion I could have earned. After she passed away, my daughter became my entire world. I never regretted choosing my family. I only hoped that someday I would find honest work that allowed me to keep moving forward. Olivia felt her heart grow heavier with admiration rather than pity. She realized that the greatest achievement standing before her was not hidden inside patents, awards, or forgotten newspaper articles. It was the quiet strength of a father who had sacrificed everything important in the eyes of the world without sacrificing the goodness that made him extraordinary. And as every person in the room looked at Ethan Walker with entirely new eyes, respect quietly replaced curiosity, and admiration silently took the place of assumption. No one spoke for several long moments after Ethan finished. The afternoon sunlight poured through the towering windows, painting warm reflections across the conference table as if the city itself had fallen silent to honor a truth that had waited 15 years to be heard. Olivia looked around the room and saw something she had never witnessed during any board meeting. Titles no longer mattered. Expensive suits no longer carried authority. Every executive, investor, and department head was simply looking at one quiet father with a respect that could never be purchased. Olivia stepped closer and extended a blue employee folder toward Ethan. "Yesterday you applied for the most overlooked position in this building," she said with a gentle smile. "Today I would like to offer you something entirely different." Ethan accepted the folder but did not open it immediately. "This is not an executive contract," Olivia continued. "It is an invitation to become Director of Innovation and Mentorship. I do not need someone to impress shareholders. I need someone who can teach brilliant people how to become good people." Ethan remained silent for a moment before finally opening the folder. The position included flexible hours, health benefits, educational support for Grace, and one condition personally added by Olivia herself. Family always comes first. Ethan looked up with genuine gratitude. "You rewrote the company policy." Olivia smiled warmly. "No, I finally understood what the policy should have been all along." Quiet laughter softened the room, followed by the first heartfelt applause of the afternoon. It began with the young facilities technician Ethan had helped earlier that day. Then the maintenance employee joined in. Soon every executive around the table rose to their feet. The standing ovation was not for an engineer, nor for a forgotten inventor. It was for a man who had spent years proving that dignity never needed an audience. Later that evening, Ethan stopped outside Lincoln Elementary just as Grace ran toward him with her backpack bouncing behind her. She searched his face with hopeful eyes before asking the question she had carried all day. "Did it go well?" Ethan knelt beside her and smiled. "Better than I ever imagined." Grace wrapped her arms around him without asking for details. She had always trusted the smile before the words. The next morning, father and daughter returned to Bennett Dynamics together. Employees who had barely noticed Ethan the day before now greeted him with sincere respect, but nothing about his walk had changed. He still held the door open for strangers. He still thanked the receptionist by name. He still stopped to help the elderly maintenance employee push the same cleaning cart across the lobby. Olivia watched from the balcony and quietly smiled. Greatness had not arrived in her company that week. It had simply returned. As the months passed, Bennett Dynamics became known not only for groundbreaking technology, but also for the culture that Ethan quietly nurtured. Young engineers stayed after work to mentor interns. Managers learned employees' names before discussing performance. Innovation flourished because kindness was no longer treated as weakness. One spring afternoon, Grace visited the office after school, carrying a handmade card for her father. Before Ethan could reach her, Olivia knelt to greet the little girl. Grace studied her for a moment before gently slipping her small hand into Olivia's. There was no awkwardness, no grand declaration, only the simple trust that children sometimes offer to people whose hearts feel familiar. Ethan looked at them both as the late afternoon sun filled the lobby with golden light. He realized that while life had never returned what he had lost, it had quietly given him something equally precious. Not another beginning, but another chance. And as the three of them walked together toward the glass doors with the city glowing beyond them, every person who watched understood the lesson that no award, fortune, or title could ever teach. The strongest legacy a person leaves behind is not the success the world remembers, but the kindness that quietly changes someone else's future.